Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? It wasn't an accident, it was habit, a pattern. She was a shadow among them, the clerk, the woman who shuffled papers, filed after-action reports, and refilled printer toner when it ran dry. When the captain walked in, his eyes skipped her as though she didn't exist. When the young privates joked about battle scars and adrenaline highs, they didn't even bother lowering their voices in her presence. She wasn't one of them. She never had been. And yet, when the alarm screamed that afternoon, when the desert itself seemed to split open with fire, she was the only one who didn't stumble. The first explosion rattled the barracks. Dust and grit sprayed the walls like broken glass. Men cursed, boots slamming against concrete as they rushed for positions. Outside, mortars dropped like thunderbolts, flaring the sky into ragged flame. Captain Cross's voice bellowed over the chaos, furious and sharp. "Positions, move your asses, hold the line." Ward didn't move, not yet. She watched. Her hands trembled against the edge of the desk, but her eyes, steady, sharp, calculating, tracked the sound. The whistle of incoming fire, the stutter of machine guns, the screams of the wounded already bleeding into the dirt outside the wire, every detail slotted into place. Then Cross stormed back into the cramped outpost office, his face red with rage. His rifle clattered against the wall as he cursed, smacked it with his palm, then hurled it straight into her chest. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. "Make yourself useful, Ward," he barked, spit flecking her cheek. "Try not to shoot your own boots." Laughter, sharp and cruel, spilled from two soldiers nearby. A desk jockey with a broken rifle in the middle of a firefight. What could possibly go wrong? The weapon was fouled, anyone could see it. A jammed bolt, dust choking the chamber, worthless, a setup for humiliation. But she caught it. Her hands closed instinctively, like muscle memory had been waiting for this exact moment. Private Mason Lee saw it. The youngest of them, cheeks still too soft for the desert, crouched against the wall with fear already clouding his eyes. He watched her cradle that rifle, and something unsettled him. The way her shoulders shifted, the way her breathing changed. He had seen soldiers fumble with weapons under pressure, seen panic strip men down to raw nerves. She wasn't panicking. Cross sneered, leaning close enough for her to smell the sour sweat on his skin. "Let's see if the secretary remembers which way the barrel points." Then he shoved past her, convinced he had cut her down to size. Mason didn't move. He couldn't. His eyes stayed locked on her hands. Because they weren't trembling anymore. They moved with precision, familiarity, fingers dancing across steel like a pianist returning to an old song. Bolt pulled, casing cleared, feed ramp scraped free of grit, magazine receded, charging handle racked hard. The sound of the rifle, snapping back into working order, cut cleaner than any insult. It took her seconds. Outside, the desert howled. The camp convulsed under incoming fire. A guard tower collapsed in a rain of wood and steel, men screaming as they scrambled for cover. Dust thickened into choking clouds. Cross shouted into his radio again, his voice cracking with static. "Hold the line, keep your sectors tight. Where the hell is our support?" The radio answered with silence. And in that silence, Ward dropped low behind a wall, pressed the stock against her shoulder, and listened. There it was. A rifle crack, faint, deliberate, not the frantic scatter of insurgent fire, a marksman, someone orchestrating the chaos from distance. Her lips moved, barely. Mason leaned closer, trying to hear over the thundering battle. "Northeast rise, 620 out." He blinked. "What?" Her eyes never left the horizon. "Sniper, behind the rocks. If second squad doesn't shift, he'll gut them." The young private froze. How could she possibly know that? How could she hear it through all this madness? "Tell the captain," she said, calm, even. Mason ran. He didn't think, he just moved. Cross nearly tore him in half when he stammered out her warning. "You taking orders from her now?" Cross roared. From a file clerk, "Get back to your post." He shoved Mason away. Then the shot came. The same hollow crack. A soldier from Second Squad spun sideways, blood blossoming across his uniform. The others scattered in panic, screaming for a medic. Cross whipped toward the ridge. His face went pale. Mason stumbled back, his chest heaving. He looked at through the smoke. She hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, just watched. And Mason knew, whatever she was, this wasn't luck. This wasn't guessing, she knew. Another rocket slammed into the comms tower, showering sparks and flame across the compound. Shouts echoed, weapons rattled, and Cross barked useless orders into the chaos. But Mason's eyes stayed fixed on her, because her stillness unnerved him more than the explosions. She was too calm, too certain. And then she moved. Crouching low, weaving through wreckage, her path calculated, deliberate. Not a sprint, not a panic, every step chosen with care. She slipped into the bunker and re-emerged with ammunition strapped across her vest, magazines sorted by type, tourniquet in her pouch, every movement efficient, unhurried. The men around her barely noticed. They were too busy firing blindly into smoke, but Mason noticed. He saw her gear herself like someone who had done this 1,000 times. Another explosion rattled the ground, tearing another hole in the barricade. Fighters surged through, shadows in the smoke, shouting with brutal intensity. Cross's voice thundered again, breaking apart in rage. "Ward, I told you to fetch supplies, not play soldier. Drop that rifle before you kill yourself." She didn't answer. Her silence was heavier than his shouting. Mason's pulse hammered. He pressed against the wall beside her, clutching his own rifle with white-knuckle panic. He could barely breathe. She, meanwhile, slid into firing position, her cheek pressed against the stock. Her breathing slowed. The chaos dimmed around her. Mason felt it, a shift, as if the battlefield itself had narrowed to the ahead. And then, for the first time since the battle began, she fired. A burst, sharp, controlled. The fighters at the breach staggered. One dropped, another fell back. Her shots weren't frantic, they were surgical. Mason's mouth went dry. He had fired twice as many rounds already and hadn't landed a thing. She moved like someone who wasn't guessing, who wasn't just surviving. Cross muttered something, an insult, a denial, but the men near them weren't listening anymore. They were watching her. Mason saw it too late, the way her sleeve had slipped back when she shifted position. For a heartbeat, the scar caught the light, circular, roughened, etched deep into her shoulder. Not an accident. The mark of a rifle pressed into flesh by years of recoil. His stomach turned cold. She wasn't who she said she was. Not the paper-pushing clerk, not the quiet shadow and admin fatigues. No. Something else. Why did her silence weigh heavier than the captain's shouting? It wasn't just silence, it was steadiness, a rhythm that cut against the chaos. Men clutched their rifles, eyes darting, breath ragged with fear. But when they caught sight of her crouched at the sandbag wall, her rifle poised, her movements exact, something shifted. Not confidence, not yet, but the faintest thread of it. Outside the wire, the desert roared. Mortars pounded in a steady rhythm, chewing up barricades, ripping open defenses. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the compound, rattling teeth and shaking lungs. The sky was a storm of grit, a veil so thick it blurred friend from foe. Captain Cross stomped through the madness, red-faced and furious, trying to hold command with sheer volume. "Hold the line, don't let them through. Ward, damn it, I said move supplies, not play commando." His voice was a whip, but whips only work when men still believe in them. Ignored him. Her cheek pressed into the worn stock. Her finger brushed the trigger. Her breathing slowed again until the noise dulled at the edges. Through smoke, silhouettes surged, fighters pouring through gaps in the perimeter. She fired, controlled bursts. 2 attackers dropped instantly. Another stumbled, shrieking, dragging his leg back into cover. The men nearest her flinched, not from fear but from disbelief. She wasn't spraying rounds blindly like the rest. She was cutting with precision. Mason saw it in her shoulders, in her eyes, in the way her hands moved without wasted effort. This wasn't improvisation. This wasn't luck. This was training. The kind you didn't get filing reports. The kind you didn't forget. "Who the hell is she?" one soldier muttered. His words vanished under the next mortar blast, but the question lingered in every pair of eyes. Cross stormed back toward her, jabbing a finger hard enough to nearly strike her face. "I said drop that rifle, you'll get us all killed." She met his glare without a word. Her silence was sharper than any retort. For the first time, Mason saw something flicker across the captain's face. Not just anger, fear. Another explosion ripped into the northern wall, blasting concrete into shards. Fighters rushed the gap, their cries high and feral. The defenders scrambled, their formation collapsing. Moved before orders came. She shoved Mason down behind cover, leveled her rifle, and let off a tight string of bursts that split the charge in two. Bodies fell into the dust. The surge slowed. Mason's chest heaved. His own rifle shook in his hands. He had fired a dozen rounds and hit nothing. She, in the same time, had cut the attack apart. He turned toward her, mouth dry. Where did you learn to fight like that?" For the first time since the battle began, she answered him. Her voice was low, flat, edged with something unspoken. "A long time ago." Then she slammed a fresh magazine into place. The words hung between them, heavier than the smoke. A long time ago. It was an answer, but it was. And Mason knew she was hiding something. The scar on her shoulder, the way she heard the sniper before anyone else, the calm precision that belonged to someone who had lived in this storm before. She wasn't a clerk, not really. But who was she? Why had she buried it? And what would it cost her to bring it back now? Another blast shook the ground, tearing through the communications antenna, sparks showering across the compound. Cross's voice cracked as he screamed into his radio, desperation bleeding through fury. "Where the hell is support?" The radio spat static, no answer. The men faltered, panic edged their movements. The captain's voice no longer steadied them, it frayed them further. But didn't flinch. Her silence became their anchor. Mason saw it in the way soldiers glanced at her between reloads, saw it in the way they shifted unconsciously when she shifted, matching her rhythm. Cross saw it too. He turned redder, shouting louder, trying to drown her out. But shouting couldn't erase what they had seen. One of the older sergeants, blood streaking his cheek, caught a glimpse of her shoulder when her vest shifted. His eyes widened, his mouth tightening. He said nothing, but Mason caught it. Recognition. Not confusion, not disbelief, recognition. And then it spread, not with words, but with silence. A silence charged with the possibility that the woman they had dismissed wasn't who she seemed. Not by a long shot. Another wave slammed into the barricade. Fighters pressed harder, sensing the defenders' fray. Braced herself, her rifle snapping in measured bursts, cutting holes into the surge. The stock pressed into that groove again, fitting perfectly, as though it had never left. Mason felt his pulse hammer. He didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were sliding into place. The scar, the precision, the instincts. She wasn't just some hidden veteran. She was something more. The kind of soldier men whispered about but never saw. And if that was true, then what the hell was she doing here, hiding in paperwork, living as a shadow? Why had she buried herself alive? The thought tore at him, almost as much as the gunfire tearing at the walls. Another burst of mortar fire slammed into the camp. The ground heaved. Men ducked low, coughing through the grit. Cross's voice cracked again, a desperate roar. Fall back, fall back. But no one moved. They were watching her instead. Her silence held them. Her steadiness bound them. And for the first time since the battle began, they weren't just surviving, they were following. Not Cross. Her. Ward. The ghost they hadn't yet recognized. How could one woman sound calmer than the storm around her? That question pulsed in Mason Lee's mind as another barrage hammered the northern wall, buckling sandbags and splitting wood beams into kindling. The desert coughed smoke and flame into the compound, thick enough to choke every breath. Men shouted blind, firing into haze, their discipline shredding with every passing second. But Ward crouched low, her cheek pressed steady against her rifle stock, her eyes unblinking through the dust. She breathed as though time itself obeyed her rhythm. And when she fired, the sound cracked cleaner than the chaos itself. Another fighter fell, another surge broke apart. Around her, soldiers began to notice, subtly at first, a glance, a hesitation, a shift of posture that matched hers. It wasn't loyalty yet, it wasn't faith, but it was gravity. Even Cross could feel it. His voice thundered across the den, ragged, desperate. Hold steady, damn it. Ward, I told you to fall back, you're not." His order snapped short when another round from the ridge punched through the smoke, slamming into the dirt at his feet, spraying grit across his uniform. He staggered back, pale. Didn't look at him, she only spoke, flat and cold. "Stay low, Captain, you're silhouetting yourself." The words cut sharper than shrapnel. The men nearby froze. For the first time, someone had corrected him out loud, not in whispers, not under their breath, out loud. Cross's mouth worked, but nothing came. He saw it in their eyes, their glances toward her, not him. He felt the authority slipping like sand through his fists, and no amount of shouting could drag it back. Mason saw it too, and part of him the captain. But more than that, he feared what it meant. Because Ward wasn't taking command by choice. She wasn't posturing, wasn't barking for control. She was simply acting as if survival demanded it. And men were following because they saw truth in her stillness. Another surge pressed through the breach, shrieking war cries that tore at raw nerves. Shifted, stock braced into that groove on her shoulder, firing controlled bursts. 2 dropped, 3 faltered. Mason tried to mimic her breathing, matching his sights to her rhythm. For the first time since the fight began, his shots landed where they meant to. He felt steadier. Because of her. But when she reloaded, sliding low to swap magazines, Mason saw it again. The scar. It wasn't just a wound, it was a map. Circular, layered, etched deep into skin like a brand pressed by years of recoil. That wasn't the mark of a paper pusher who picked up a rifle once in desperation. That was the mark of someone who had lived behind a scope, day after day, year after year, until the steel itself had carved memory into her flesh. He wanted to ask again, to demand the truth. But the look in her eyes silenced him. Not because she glared, but because her gaze wasn't here. It was far away. On another battlefield, another storm, another memory she couldn't shake. Cross stormed closer, fury twisting his face. His pride bled raw, but his voice cracked. "You think you know better than me, you think." Her reply was ice. "Either fight or step aside. People are dying." The force of her tone stopped him cold. Mason felt the hairs on his neck rise. He had never heard her speak with that kind of authority. Not once. Not in months of serving beside her in quiet anonymity. And the men around them heard it too. Something inside the line shifted. Orders still came from Cross, but the weight had changed. His voice was noise. Hers was gravity. Another explosion tore through the compound, collapsing a section of wall. Fighters swarmed, their formation too precise for chaos. Someone was orchestrating them. Mason could feel it now, just as she had. Anne's eyes narrowed on the haze. Her jaw tightened. She was calculating again, her mind drawing patterns invisible to the rest. Mason leaned closer, heart pounding. You know who's directing them, don't you? Her silence answered more than words could. Cross barked again, desperate, trying to mask the collapse of his authority. Ward, drop that damn weapon before. But before he could finish, another rifle crack split the air, and one of his men toppled, lifeless, blood soaking into the sand. The captain ducked low, face pale, teeth clenched. He didn't shout another order. And for the first time, Mason saw fear, not of the enemy but of her. Because she wasn't afraid. And that terrified him. The battle raged harder, mortars pounded, fighters surged, men screamed. And through it all, Ward crouched steady, her rifle cutting through the madness one precise shot at a time. The mask she had worn for so long, of anonymity, of invisibility, was cracking. Every squeeze of her trigger pulled another piece away. Every glance from a soldier carried another unspoken question. Who was she? And why had she hidden in plain sight for so long? The older sergeant, blood streaking down his temple, finally whispered it. Low, almost reverent. I've seen a scar like that before. Mason whipped toward him, his chest tightening. Where? The man's eyes didn't leave her. Delta, they called her Ghost. The word shivered through Mason's bones. Ghost. He had heard the name whispered in barracks before, passed in rumors from unit to unit. A sniper who shouldn't exist, a figure who made impossible shots, missions that should have ended in annihilation but didn't. A phantom who always vanished before anyone could confirm she had been there at all. Half legend, half warning. He looked at her now, the woman who had typed up his rosters, who had walked the camp as though invisible, and every piece clicked. The scar, the silence, the precision, the calm. She wasn't just Ward. She was Ghost. The legend buried alive. And Mason knew in that moment that the battlefield had just changed forever. Because Ghost had stepped back into the fire. Someone else. But who? Why had she buried it? And why now, was she letting it out again? The wall shook with another explosion. Debris rained down. Cross shouted for a retreat, his voice ragged, but the men hesitated. Their eyes shifted, not toward him but toward her. Ward didn't rise to meet their gaze. She didn't crave it. She didn't ask for it. But she gave them something Cross couldn't. Calm in the storm. Steel in the collapse. And Mason knew, with a clarity that terrified him, that their survival didn't rest on shouted orders or rank. It rested on her. The woman they had scorned, the clerk they had mocked, the ghost in plain sight. And as the ground trembled beneath another mortar strike, she whispered just loud enough for Mason to hear. This is where the real fight begins. What breaks first in battle, walls or men? At Camp Resolute, both were splintering. The outer barricade sagged under another barrage, sandbags shredded into clouds of grit. Gunfire sparked off twisted steel, tearing holes into the last defenses. The desert itself seemed alive, roaring in waves of smoke and blood. But inside the compound, something else was breaking, faith in their captain. Cross shouted until his voice cracked, spittle flying, orders scattered and hollow. Men obeyed out of muscle memory, but their eyes betrayed them. They drifted always back toward her. Toward Ward. She crouched low, steady against the wall, her rifle braced, her breath measured. Each squeeze of her trigger cut another line into the chaos, carving back the tide one body at a time. No shouting, no theatrics, just precision. Mason Lee felt it in his chest, how her stillness anchored him, how even his own breathing synced to her rhythm. He had never known calm in fire before, but beside her, it existed. And that terrified him as much as it steadied him. Because she wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. Not with a scar etched into her shoulder that spoke of thousands of hours behind a rifle. Not with instincts that cut through smoke like a second sight. not with a name whispered in shadows that he had dared never believe was real. Ghost. The word stuck in his throat like ash. She had never admitted it. She had never spoken of it, but Mason didn't need her to. He knew. The men near her knew. And Cross, though he would never confess it, saw it too. It burned him alive. He stormed across the rubble, yanked at the strap of her rifle, his rage trembling into something smaller, something closer to fear. You want to play soldier, then take mine. He ripped his own carbine from his back, the weapon he had cursed for days, and shoved it into her chest. It's been nothing but trouble, just like you. The insult struck hard enough to draw a few glances, but his smirk faltered when her hands moved without hesitation. She broke the rifle down in seconds, stripped the jammed casing, cleared the fouled chamber, and reassembled it faster than most of his men could blink. When she pulled the charging handle and snapped it back into firing order, silence rippled through the squad. Cross's laughter died in his throat. His jaw tightened, his pride bleeding out of him. But said nothing. She simply shifted back into position, cheek to stock, eyes narrowing through the haze. Her breath steadied. And then she fired. One round, clean, surgical. A fighter at the breach dropped instantly, his weapon clattering into dust. The men froze. They had seen her clear a rifle like a machine. Now they saw her fire like one too. Lucky, Cross muttered, but his voice shook thin and brittle even to his own ears. Mason felt it then, the balance tipping, not just in the firefight but in the air between them all. Cross had words. She had gravity. The next surge hit harder, a flood of shadows pressing through smoke. Their cohesion was too sharp to be chaos. Someone out there, unseen, deliberate, was pulling the strings. Its eyes locked on the. Through the haze she saw him, not clearly, just a figure elevated above the others, confident, directing with sharp gestures, a commander who believed himself untouchable. Her jaw tightened. "We need to silence him," she murmured. Mason's head snapped toward her. "What?" Her eyes stayed forward. The one giving orders, cut the head off, the body collapses. Mason's breath caught. It wasn't just a plan, it was conviction. Cross heard it and his fury erupted. He grabbed her shoulder, trying to drag her back from the barrier. "You'll get us all killed with your games." She spun, her voice cutting sharper than any bullet. "Either fight or step aside." The words stunned him into silence. Not because of their volume, but because of the authority in them. The kind of authority born from fire, not from rank. The kind of authority men follow. And Mason realized then that the captain wasn't just losing command. He had already lost it. The soldiers fought harder, not because Cross ordered them to, but because Ward, the ghost they had scorned, stood at their center. Every time she shifted, they shifted. Every time she fired, they steadied. The scar on her shoulder gleamed again as her vest slipped in the chaos, and this time more than Mason saw it. The older sergeant's eyes tightened. His jaw clenched with recognition. No one said it aloud, not yet. But they didn't have to. The truth was spreading like smoke. Ward was not who she pretended to be. And as the next mortar shrieked overhead and split the compound with a blast that rattled bones, Mason knew one thing with chilling clarity. The battlefield had turned. Not because of numbers, not because of reinforcements. Because of her. Because the ghost was walking again. How many lives could hinge on a single breath? That question pressed heavy on Mason Lee as he crouched behind shattered concrete, grit stinging his eyes. The camp was collapsing piece by piece. The outer wall sagged like broken teeth. Mortars rained without mercy. The defenders' ammo dwindled to desperate scraps. Every instinct screamed they were done. But then he looked at her. Ward. Her cheek pressed steady against her rifle stock, her movements exact, her breathing measured like a metronome no chaos could disturb. And Mason knew they weren't finished yet. Not while she was here. Not while Ghost breathed. The name had slipped from the older sergeant's lips earlier, carried like a rumor into smoke. And once heard, Mason couldn't hear it. Ghost. The sniper who wasn't supposed to exist. The phantom whispered across units. A soldier who had vanished years ago, marked as dead, remembered only in half-believed stories. And here she was, hidden in plain sight. A clerk in dusty fatigues. The mask was gone now. Every movement exposed her truth. Cross knew it too. That was why his rage had curdled into something smaller, uglier. Fear. He barked orders still, but fewer men obeyed. They didn't mean to disobey, it was instinct. Their eyes just slid toward her, toward the calm that cut through fire. Cross's pride burned hotter than the desert sun, but his words carried no weight anymore. Because men don't follow noise when they've seen gravity. Shifted her position, sliding along the debris to cover another angle. Her vest slipped, and the scar etched into her shoulder came into view again, undeniable this time. Not an accident, not a wound, a mark carved by years of recoil. And now more than Mason saw it. The silence among the soldiers deepened, charged. Recognition passed without words. This wasn't a clerk, this wasn't luck. This was someone who had walked the storm before. Someone who had survived what should have killed her. Someone who had returned from the dead. Another surge slammed against the wall. Shadows spilled through smoke, rifles flashing, voices chanting. The rhythm was too precise. This wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Her jaw tightened. She saw it again, the elevated figure on the ridge, directing with sharp gestures, a commander who believed himself untouchable. Her whisper carried only to Mason, but its weight crushed him. If we don't take him, this camp dies. Mason's throat went dry. That's impossible. Her cheek pressed into the stock, her eyes never blinked. Impossible doesn't matter. Another rifle crack tore through the haze, a defender toppling with blood soaking his sleeve. The distant marksman, the commander's eyes, the enemy's precision. They were being dismantled piece by piece. Unless she answered. Unless she made the shot. Cross stomped closer, fury masking the collapse of his authority. He yanked at her shoulder, nearly spitting in her face. You're going to get us all killed. Put it down. She didn't even look at him. Her voice was low, cold steel. Stay low, Captain, or die standing tall for nothing. The men froze. None of them had ever dared speak to him like that. But more than shock, something else filled their eyes, relief. Because someone was finally saying what they all felt. Cross staggered back, pale beneath grime. His mouth opened but no sound came. And shifted flat against the ground, sliding into prone. Her pack became her rest. Her cheek slid into the groove that fit like it had been waiting for this moment. Mason's heart hammered, his ears rang. Ma'am, he whispered, voice trembling, you can't, not with that rifle, not at this distance. It's... Her breathing slowed. The world narrowed to silence. Smoke curled, shadows shifted. Through gaps in haze she saw him, the commander, elevated above his men, gesturing with brutal precision. A radio strapped to his back, antenna jutting high. His posture screamed authority, untouchable. She lined her sights. Crosswind left, heat shimmer 2 clicks high, barrel fouling pulls right. She murmured the corrections under her breath, words only she could understand. Her finger found the trigger. Mason couldn't breathe. The battlefield dimmed. For a heartbeat, time belonged only to her. She exhaled and squeezed. The rifle barked, a sharp crack swallowed by thunder. For a second, nothing. Then the figure jerked backward, his body crumpled. The radio shattered, sparking as it tore free from his back. Chaos rippled outward. The commander was down. The voice that had orchestrated the storm was gone, and with it the enemy's rhythm dissolved. Shouts turned frantic. Fighters stumbled, firing wildly, cohesion gone. Inside Camp Resolute, silence fell heavier than dust. Every man who saw it understood. She had done the impossible. She had cut the head off the storm. Cross raised binoculars with trembling hands, desperate for denial. But when he saw the body sprawled lifeless, his jaw slackened. "What the hell?" he whispered hollow. Mason could only stare at her, awe swallowing every word. She cycled the bolt, chambered another round, her eyes scanning for secondary threats. She didn't celebrate, she didn't smile. Her focus stayed cold, detached, as though victory cost her more than defeat. Around them, defenders erupted, some cheering, some whispering, most simply staring. Hope surged like oxygen into lungs that had been starved. They weren't finished, not because of rank, not because of command. Because of her. Because the ghost had risen. And Mason knew then, with a clarity that chilled his bones. This wasn't just survival. This was revelation. What happens when silence is louder than victory? That question hung over Camp Resolute in the seconds after the shot. The battle didn't stop immediately. Fighters still shouted, rifles still cracked, mortars still boomed across the ridge. But something deeper had shifted. The storm no longer moved in rhythm. The pressure that had pinned them for hours was gone. The enemy was unraveling. Mason Lee saw it first in their silhouettes. Confusion, faltering movements, no longer the precise, orchestrated pushes, just scattered surges, panicked and blind. The commander was down. Ghost had cut the head from the serpent. And the men around her knew it, even if none of them said it aloud. Cross still clutched his binoculars, knuckles white, jaw slack. His lips parted as if words might come, but nothing did. Because how could he explain it? The woman he had mocked, the clerk he had belittled, had just done what none of his dared attempt. She had taken the impossible shot, and in doing so, she had taken his authority. Mason's chest heaved, his pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to cheer, to shout, to thank her, but when he looked at her, he froze. She wasn't celebrating. Her expression was cold, distant. Her eyes scanned the haze for threats, her jaw tight, her body still coiled like the storm hadn't ended. Because for her it hadn't. She knew the truth. The enemy would retreat, but they would remember, and they would come harder next time. She didn't say it, she didn't need to. Her silence carried it, heavy and certain. The defenders, though, erupted. Some laughed with relief, others shouted until their throats cracked. A few simply stared, whispering to one another, their eyes locked on her as if seeing her for the first time. "Who is she?" one murmured. "Not a clerk," another muttered back. "Not even close." The older sergeant spoke quieter still, his words barely carrying through the grit. "Ghost." The name cut through the noise. Mason's breath caught. He had heard it before, but hearing it spoken aloud in daylight, in front of men who had just bled beside her, made it real. The scar, the precision, the calm. Ghost. The myth wasn't a myth. She was flesh and bone, crouched beside them, rifle still smoking. And for the first time, Mason believed in legends. Cross heard it too, his face twisted, pride bleeding from him faster than his words could cover. He opened his mouth, ready to snarl denial, but another sound drowned him. Rotor blades. Distant at first, then louder, closer, heavy. The men looked skyward, some ducking instinctively, others frozen in disbelief. Not medevac birds, not supply drops. These machines moved differently, faster, sharper, their profiles dark against the glare of the sun. 2 helicopters swept low over the ridge, rotors chopping the air into whirlwinds. Door gunners leaned out, spraying precise bursts into retreating enemy fighters. The sound ripped across the desert like thunder given teeth. The helicopters banked hard, then hovered, side doors flung wide. Ropes dropped before the skids touched ground. Figures slid down fast, black-clad, faceless, weapons snapping into ready positions before their boots even hit dirt. Delta Force. The shift inside the compound was immediate. Exhausted soldiers straightened. Relief surged, disbelief mixing with awe. They had been saved. But Ward didn't move. She watched them spread across the defenses with terrifying efficiency, reinforcing weak points, clearing stragglers. Their presence changed the air. Where there had been chaos, there was suddenly discipline. And then one of them stopped. Helmet tilted toward her, visor reflecting the haze. He stood still for a beat too long, weapon lowering slightly. Then he pulled his ballistic glasses free. The face beneath was weathered, streaked with gray at the temples. His chest tightened. She knew him. Master Sergeant Daniel. It had been years, too many years, but she knew that face as well as her own. And the look in his eyes told her he knew her too. "Ward," he called, voice rough through the smoke. Then softer, disbelief twisting into certainty. "No, Ghost." The word landed heavier than any explosion. Men froze, soldiers turned. Confusion, awe, and shock rippled across their faces. Mason's heart slammed in his chest. He had whispered it to himself, had suspected, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing it confirmed by one of Delta's own, left him breathless. Cross's head snapped toward her, eyes wide, jaw working but voiceless. The men stared. And knew. Her mask was gone. She had buried Ghost, buried her under paperwork and silence, but the battlefield had dragged her back into the light. She wanted to deny it, to turn away, to vanish again, but she didn't. Because legends don't vanish when others speak their name. They rise. She adjusted her rifle strap and said nothing. Silence was all the confirmation needed. He stepped closer, his expression torn between disbelief and grief. "We held your memorial," he said, voice low, ragged. "Your star is on the wall at—" The words cut deeper than shrapnel. The camp around them held its breath. Mason's pulse thundered, Cross's face crumpled. The men whispered louder now, threads of awe weaving into the name. Ghost. The phantom who was supposed to be dead. Alive here with them. His jaw tightened. She forced her focus outward, scanning the horizon, refusing to give them more than her silence. But inside her chest ached. Because was right. She had died, not in blood but in choice. She had buried herself to escape the weight of the name. And now the battlefield had exhumed her. No matter how she tried, she could not bury Ghost again. What happens to a man when command slips from his hands? Captain Cross looked hollow, standing amid the dust and wreckage, binoculars dangling useless at his side. His face was red, but not from heat. Red from rage strangled by fear, from authority bled out in silence. The soldiers didn't look at him anymore. They didn't hear him. They looked at her. Ward. No, Ghost. The name spread in whispers across the camp. The men clung to it like a lifeline, as if speaking it aloud gave weight to what they'd just seen, as if it proved legends weren't just stories. Cross's lips moved, but nothing came. He looked smaller now, his rank stitched on cloth but meaningless in air that no longer bent to him. And then the helicopters came back. Bigger this time. Twin-rotor Chinooks, heavy, low, kicking up storms of grit that swallowed the camp. The earth trembled as they settled, ramp doors yawning open. From the first stepped soldiers in darker uniforms, heavier armor. Their insignia gleamed even through the dust. Command had arrived. And at their center walked a figure whose presence bent the chaos around him into silence. Brigadier General Monroe. The kind of man whose name was spoken with the same weight as orders themselves. His shoulders carried decades of war. His gaze cut through smoke like glass. The camp stilled. Even the wounded struggled upright, instinct pulling them to attention. Cross tried to compose himself, straightening his uniform, stepping forward as though ready to receive commendation. But Monroe's eyes weren't on him. They found her. Ward. The ghost. His boots crunched through grit as he stopped before her. For a long moment he said nothing. The wind whipped between them, dust clinging to sweat and blood. Then, in a voice heavy with both disbelief and inevitability, he said, "Lieutenant." The word carved silence into stone. Mason's chest froze. The soldiers around him stiffened, eyes darting between them. "Lieutenant." Not clerk, not secretary. She had been an officer. Monroe's jaw tightened, as though the name itself pained him. "We buried you," he said. "Do you understand that? We folded a flag. We gave your mother the star. We carved your name into stone." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was heavier than shouting. His hands tightened on her rifle strap. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. Silence was her armor. Cross blinked rapidly, confused, desperate. "General, sir, she's just a clerk, she." Monroe's glare cut him down mid-sentence. "Captain, be silent before I make you silent." The words hit like a hammer. Cross's face drained. His mouth closed with a snap. And Monroe turned back to her. "I don't care how you crawled out of the grave, Lieutenant. I don't care what name you've been hiding under. What matters is this." He gestured at the battlefield, the broken walls, the men who had steadied under her silence. "They followed you, not him." His tone left no room for denial. His jaw clenched. "I didn't ask them to." "Leaders don't ask," Monroe said. "They become, whether they want it or not." The word struck deeper than shrapnel. Because she didn't want it. She hadn't for years. That was why she had buried Ghost. That was why she had walked away. But Monroe's gaze left no escape. The men around them watched, their hope fragile, their fear raw. And she realized something painful. It wasn't about her anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Cross finally found his voice, trembling but sharp. "Sir, with respect, she disobeyed orders. She undermined command, she." Monroe didn't even look at him. "Captain Cross," he said flatly, "you are relieved, effective immediately." The words fell like a guillotine. The soldiers stiffened, stunned. Mason's breath caught. Relief flooded his chest. Cross staggered, his pride crumbling into ash. "You can't." "Remove his weapon," Monroe ordered. Two Delta soldiers stepped forward, swift, precise. Cross resisted for a heartbeat, then faltered, his rifle torn from his grasp, his face twisted in humiliation. He was no longer their captain. The men didn't cheer, they didn't mock. They simply turned their eyes back to her. To Ghost. Monroe's gaze hardened. "You were buried once, Lieutenant. Do you want to be buried again, or will you stand?" Her silence cracked then, not with words but with breath, sharp, shaken, the weight of years pressing into her lungs. She wanted to say no. She wanted to tell him she couldn't. That Ghost had died for a reason. But then she looked around. At Mason, still clutching his rifle with trembling hands but standing because of her steadiness. At the wounded propped against rubble, watching her with fragile hope. At the older sergeant, blood streaking his face, his lips tight around the word he had whispered earlier, Ghost. And she knew. She couldn't bury it again. Not now. Not when they needed her. Her jaw set, her silence became her answer. Monroe's nod was slight, but heavy with finality. "Then Ghost returns." The words were both sentence and resurrection. And Mason knew, as the desert wind whipped dust around them, that nothing in this war, or in her life, would ever be the same again. What remains when the gunfire stops? The silence was not peace. It was heavy, suffocating. Smoke hung low, curling around broken walls. The acrid tang of powder clung to every breath. Men coughed, staggered, dragged the wounded into makeshift lines. The camp was not destroyed, but neither was it whole. It was like them. Ward stood at the center, rifle slung, vest torn, her face streaked with grit. She hadn't spoken since Monroe named her. She hadn't needed to. Her silence had said more than any vow. But inside she was not still. Inside a storm churned. Ghost. The name echoed louder than the mortars had. Spoken by Monroe, confirmed by, whispered by the men who had seen her fire the impossible shot. She had buried Ghost once, buried her so deep she had thought the world would forget. She had tried to become no one, a shadow behind desks, a ghost in another sense, unseen, unremarkable. But the battlefield had dragged her back. And she knew the truth now. Ghost wasn't gone. Ghost had never been gone. She had only been waiting. Mason Lee watched her from a distance, his rifle limp at his side. His chest still heaved, but not from running, from awe, from fear, from the raw realization that the woman he had filed reports beside was something else entirely. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions about the missions, about the scars, about the stories whispered in barracks across continents. But he didn't, because he understood now that some stories were not for telling. Some stories lived only in silence. Cross sat apart, stripped of weapon and command, his face pale, his pride shredded. He muttered under his breath, but no one listened. His voice had become noise. The men followed another rhythm now. Not shouted orders, not barked commands, but the steady silence of the ghost who walked among them. Approached slowly, his rifle slung, his eyes soft despite the hard lines of his face. "You were dead," he said, not accusing, not even questioning, just stating the weight of it. Didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, where smoke bled into the pale desert sky. "Maybe I was," she said quietly. The words carried like confession. His jaw tightened. He wanted to ask why she had left, why she had buried herself alive, why she had left her brothers and sisters to grieve a name etched into stone. But he didn't, because the battlefield had already answered. Some ghosts don't return until they're needed. Monroe stood nearby, arms folded, his eyes sharp but heavy with something unspoken, respect perhaps or regret. "You saved this camp," he said. "You saved them all. That shot will be remembered." His jaw tightened. Her reply was cold steel. "Don't remember the shot. Remember the ones who bled so I could take it." The silence that followed was heavier than praise. Because she meant it. The men who had fallen weren't footnotes to her. They were weight. And she would carry them. Always. The day bled into dusk. Reinforcements secured the perimeter, cleared the ridges, stabilized the wounded. For the first time, the camp breathed without flinching. But peace didn't return. Only survival. Night fell hard. The desert turned cold, the smoke clinging thicker in the still air. Fires burned low in oil drums, shadows dancing against jagged walls. Mason sat near one, his hands trembling as he turned a dented canteen in his grip. He glanced at her across the glow. She sat alone, rifle across her knees, head bowed slightly. The flames painted her face in shifting light. He wanted to thank her. He wanted to tell her she had saved him. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came. Because how do you thank someone who had just risen from legend? Instead, he just watched. And maybe that was enough. The whispers carried still, even in the quiet. Men trading fragments of the day, their voices hushed, but always the name surfaced. Ghost. No longer rumor, no longer myth. She was real. And she was here. Monroe came once more before dawn, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He stood over her for a long moment. "You can't hide again," he said quietly. "You know that." Her eyes lifted, sharp in the firelight. "Maybe I wasn't hiding," she murmured. Maybe I was trying to live. His gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. Then maybe now you live by leading. He didn't wait for her answer. He didn't need it. Because he knew as well as she did, the choice had already been made. When dawn bled pale across the desert, when the smoke lifted and the battlefield revealed its scars, the men of camp resolute rose with new gravity in their eyes. They had bled, they had nearly broken. But they had survived. Because of her. Not because she shouted, not because she claimed command. Because she stood, silent, steady, unyielding. Mason looked at her one last time before the convoy rolled in, relief and fear mingling in his chest. She didn't look back. Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. Because ghosts don't look behind. They walk forward. Into storms. Into silence. Into history. And the desert seemed to whisper with her steps. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.